Hello, my name is Kaki Ryan. I have been your TA for Comp 110 this semester, and today I'm going to be taking you through a few videos on the concepts of recursion. And so this first video is just going to be talking through at a high level what recursion is conceptually and why it's so exciting. And so the first thing I want to do is just define what this word even means, because I think for most of us it doesn't show up in our everyday vocabulary. So what is recursion? So recursion is when a process or a structure is defined in terms of itself. So for us as computer scientists, we've been spending our whole semester up to this point learning about processes and structures. And so the processes we've been talking about have been the algorithms or the programs in Python that we've been writing, right? All of these functions and small programs and bigger programs that you've been writing in your exercises and projects. These are the processes that we're talking about. And so a recursive program is one that is defined in terms of itself. So a recursive function is a function that will be calling itself. And so we'll see that in one of the subsequent videos. And a structure that we've learned about in this class is something that lives in memory, right? And so we've spent the last unit that you guys just took your quiz on was learning about objects, object-oriented programming. We learned how to define our own data structures in our code by defining classes that have their own attributes, their own methods, right? That's how you define a custom type, a custom data structure. And so a recursive data structure is one that is defined in terms of itself. So what would happen, for example, if you defined a class that had an attribute that had the same type? So we'll see an example of that in a subsequent video as well. So don't worry too much about the details here, but the overarching idea is that recursion is when a process or a structure is defined in terms of itself. And so that's what it means to us as programmers, but we actually see this all the time in real life. And so I want to just go through some examples on the next slide about how this is actually this is actually really powerful to us and is applicable in the real world. Okay, so the first example I want to talk about is the file system on your computer is an example of a recursive data structure. So all of the directories on your computer hold subdirectories that hold more subdirectories that hold files, right? So you can think of this as a recursive data structure because it's defined in terms of itself, right? Directories are defined in terms of more smaller subdirectories until eventually a directory terminates in a single collection of files, right? Or a single file. You can't have an infinite directory because your computer is a finite piece of hardware, right? You don't have infinite memory. And so that's an important piece of recursion, right? Is eventually it's going to have to stop. And we'll talk more about that in the subsequent videos. But that's something to be thinking about is when we have these processes or structures that are defined in terms of themselves, how do we make sure that we correctly terminate eventually, right? And so with this file system example, we know we don't have infinite memory on our computer, and so our file system, we have some finite amount of storage, and so that's how we're limited there with the file system example. And so just be thinking about that in the back of your mind. When we're thinking about recursion, we always want to be thinking about how do we stop the recursion eventually. Okay, what I want to give is an onion. So just like they said in Shrek, an onion has layers. So an onion is just one big vegetable, right? But in order to build up the entire onion, it's made of these individual layers that together make up the entire vegetable, but it's built up of all of these individual layers that if you peel it back, you can see they all stand alone, but together make up the entire onion. And I think that's a pattern that you see again and again with like lots of different types of vegetation and fruits and flowers and things, is like this type of pattern of like repetition, and like with tree branches and things, how things like if you have a tree branch, like the sub branches that come off of it and just like sort of multiply. And I'll show some images of this too. So recursion happens a lot in nature. Another example is, and so an onion is an example of a recursive structure, right? And then, but here's an example of a recursive process is the spread of something contagious. This could be something good or something not so good. So, I mean, you could think of this as the pandemic, or I think happiness is contagious too, but like you could think of, so if we think of it at some large scale, like 100 people are infected with happiness, right? In order for 100 people to become happy, right, that meant that 99 people were infected with the happiness, but that meant 98 were infected, and 99 or 97, and that meant 96 were. And so in order for some large amount of people to become infected, that meant some smaller amount had to become infected, and each of those like smaller subpopulations had to spread it to an additional person, right? And so you can think of like the spread of something contagious as a recursive process, because each of the subpopulations that gets infected spreads it further to create like some larger pandemic of some disease, of some good thing. But you can think of something that is, you can think of the spread or diffusion of something as a recursive process. Right, and then another example of a recursive process is like mitosis or cell division. So everybody should be at least slightly familiar with that from your high school biology class, right? So and you say, okay, you want to divide this single cell into 8 parts. So you tell the cell, okay, divide, so it becomes 2, and then you tell each one of those cells to divide, and then each of those divide, and so now you're left with 4, then you tell each of those now 4 cells to divide, and now you have 8. Okay, so you basically divided up the work recursively to get the 8 subcells, and that might not be exactly right, but the idea is you can divide up the work to recursively get the job done. All right, and so here's just some images here to conceptually encapsulate what's going on. So this is the idea of that recursive file structure. So we have the top level directory, but then we also have these subdirectories, right? So this is this structural recursion. And again, like I said, recursion's everywhere in nature. So next time you go on your nice nature walk, hopefully it's not too cold out, just be looking around and see where you see these types of patterns in nature. So here you can see like these leaves have this recursive type of pattern within them. All right. So in the next video, we'll dive a little bit deeper into how we can harness the power of recursive structures in our code.